Namely because this begins, chapter 3 really begins what you can always call the turn, so to speak. Every New Testament epistle that Paul writes, especially Paul writes, because he follows this pattern pretty distinctly, there's always a moment where a turn happens, where Paul goes from declaring to sort of describing. He goes from talking about doctrine, so the doctrine of Christ or the doctrine of the gospel, to talking about, we could call it doxology, how that doctrine informs us in the daily life. So there's this turn that happens. A really good example of this is when you go from Romans 11 to Romans 12. And you have that moment where he says, now we should be transformed. And he goes on, so on and so forth. The same thing happens in Ephesians chapter number 4, where he goes from talking about the love of God, which surpasses all understanding, and he goes and starts talking about now we are to be imitators of that love as God's children. So similarly here, he has this sort of turn where he's talked about who Christ is, and he's emphasized, in chapter number 2, he's emphasized what Christ has done. And he's talked about how this gospel raises us to life. And now this turn happens where he's transitioning, not just telling us these assertions of the gospel, but now he's telling us what this gospel actually does, and what this new life in Christ, what it's going to look like.